in the past few years. Knowledge workers are starting to see how this sort of work-centric existence is not actually serving them very well. We see a pandemic of loneliness across the country. We see people hung out to dry when their large employer lets go thousands of employees, and people questioning, I've given so much of myself to this company. And it turns out that it was a transactional relationship all along. It's nuanced. It's not just don't care about your job or do what you love or don't do what you love. What we do for work matters. And so the question here is, how do you balance the pursuit of meaningful work without letting your work subsume who you are?
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Simone Stolzoff wants you to know that you are more than what you do for a living. Work is not your family, your personal worth, or your religion. It's not a reliable source of status or measure of success. More hours can mean less quality work, and failing to find your dream job is not failure. American culture has made finding a dream job one of life's ultimate goals. Personal identity and professional roles have merged into one. And this entanglement can cost us happiness, well-being, and ultimately true career success. Why has work assumed such an all-encompassing role in American lives, and why is it such a challenge for us to detach from it? As a designer, workplace expert, and consultant to the likes of Google, Meta, and Microsoft, Simone Stolzoff, author of The Good Enough Job, is on a mission to find out. In his latest book, Simone has interviewed Michelin star chefs, Wall Street bankers, overwhelmed teachers, high-tech workers living in vans, and other workers to find out what we can lose when we expect work to be more than just a job. In this episode, Simone and I discuss the myths around work and identity, why jobs shouldn't define us, and how to build identities that are bigger than work. We also talk about designing a sustainably productive workplace culture, the connection between survival, employment, and government assistance in the U.S., and other topics. If you enjoy this episode, of course, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now I bring you Simone Stolzoff. Welcome, Simone Stolzoff, to Work for Humans.
Dart, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you've written the book, The Good Enough Job, and I think it's a fantastic title. And the way I see it is that you are challenging almost every myth that gets us into trouble at work and creates a relationship for us that's unhealthy. And some of it comes from companies themselves, but a lot of it comes from inside us and what we expect from work or how we frame work or how we frame our identity. And so it's a deep book, and it's really sort of set me back and started me thinking about a lot of the things that I work on. How did you set out to write this particular book?
Yeah, it's a good question. The old cliche is that you write the book that you need to read. And that was certainly the case for me. I think, we talked a little bit about the myths, and I think a lot of them are very intoxicating. The idea that if you do what you love, you never work a day in your life, or that your work can be your family. These are things that on the surface make a lot of sense. And I think I very much bought into the promise of sort of self-actualizing work myself. And so there's sort of the personal way in, which is I am a journalist. I've worked as a reporter for a number of years. And about 4 years ago, a design agency recruiter reached out to me from this place called IDEO, which is a design consultancy based here in the Bay Area. And I was flattered. I had never really been reached out to by a recruiter before. They always take the interview. And I sort of passively went through this interview process. The design job paid more than the journalism job. There was something novel and shiny about it. And long story short is I found myself at this career crossroads. And there was this one path of continuing to work as a magazine reporter. And there was sort of Simone the journalist. And then there was this other path that was Simone the designer. And on one hand, it's like, woe is me, like, oh, the agony of having to decide between two attractive job offers. But on the other hand, it really did send me through an existential loop. I didn't feel like I was choosing between two jobs. It felt like I was choosing between two versions of me. And so that was sort of the early impetus of wondering how work had come to be so central to my identity. And I knew that I wasn't the only one.
Very interesting that you tied it as two pathways into identity. I'm wondering if you had a story about yourself, a story that you were in, where you could play one character or another character, and whether you were also looking at two stories of yourself and what character you were going to play in it.
Yeah, I love the question. Very much so. I mean, and I'm sure some of the listeners have been at a similar career crossroads themselves. For me, I had really bought into this idea that how we spend our days is how we spend our lives. And therefore, what we choose to do for work is one of the most consequential decisions we make. I still stand by that. I think what we choose to work on is very important. Certainly, we work more than we do just about anything else. But I had this sort of white knuckle grip on this job decision. And I think it was, to what you said, this idea of my own self conception, this kind of character that I was. And if I left the journalism world, then all my other former coworkers would look down upon me. And if democracy dies in darkness, then I was turning off one more light in the room. And I was selling out by going into design. And then I had this other sort of story worked up, which is that this opportunity at this global innovation firm that I had learned about in college and grad school wanted me to work for them. And I would be an idiot not to take this opportunity. And another opportunity like this might never materialize. And I think, there's a bit of fiction in both of those. And there's a sense of sort of self-absorption of thinking that my job was going to be my sole path to transcendence. But I had really bought into that idea. And I think, many people, especially of my generation, with the fall of some things like organized religion and neighborhood and community groups, are really looking to work to hold this burden, to not just be a paycheck, but also a source of transcendence and community and purpose and meaning. And I very much was part of that movement of these sky high expectations about what a job could deliver.
Let's talk through some of the biggest myths that you explore in the book. I was going to say discovered by writing the book. Some of them may have been discovered, but I'll just say explored for now.
Yeah, so the sort of form of the book is that each chapter does two things. One is it follows a particular worker in a particular industry. And so there's a Michelin star chef, and there's a Wall Street banker, and there's a software engineer who lives in a van in the Google parking lot. And in addition to these characters and their stories, there's also a myth, one of these sort of common axioms that we tend to tell ourselves about work and what work can do. So, as I mentioned earlier, things like do what you love and never work a day in your life, or that the idea that success is synonymous with professional accomplishments. And I wanted to bring a magnifying glass to look at some of these myths under a more critical lens, because we pass these phrases around so easily, especially in social media and on LinkedIn, on Instagram. You see the post of, life is too short not to do what you love. And part of the goal of the book was for me to really double click on that and say, wait a second, are we what we do? Does professional accomplishment equal happiness and success in life? What are some ways in which we can queer some of these axioms that we hold to be self-evident?
So here are some of the ones on the list, and I want to drill into a couple of them. And so one of them is the one you just talked about, which is we are what we do. The second one is that job can in some way replace God or religion in terms of, your moral worth, but also your community. That there is a dream job is another myth, that you have to seek your dream job and anything short of your dream job is just not good enough. That your work is your worth. That your work can be a family. And this is another one we throw around all the time, which is that people will say, here at this company, we're a family. And you blew apart that myth. That more hours equals better work. And you do talk a little bit about status in one of the myths and the status of success. And how often do you hear people say, as a form of status, how many hours they worked last week? And then the last part was, one of the other parts was about office perks and how that is also a delusion. A couple of them are very connected. And so I'd like to talk about them in a connected way. And one is, we are what we do, your work is your worth, and status tied to success. And so part of the reason I want to ask about those is that it's very hard for me to escape those. And I know a lot of people that I work with that have a hard time internalizing that those are myths.
Yeah, I think, the first one is perhaps the most common and the most pernicious, this idea that we are what we do. And, it's reinforced by the cocktail party banter where we ask each other, so what do you do? Is often the first question once we meet someone. It's reinforced by the questions we ask children about who they want to be when they grow up. And, certainly what we do for work is part of who we are. It definitely contributes to our identity for some people more than others. But I think the underlying point is that a job is part of, but not the entirety of who we are. Certainly we are more than just workers. We are siblings and parents and partners and citizens and neighbors and artists and travelers and all of these distinct identities that exist within us. And yet, so often, especially in an age where people parade their professional accomplishments around for the world to see, we sort of equate your job title with not just who you are, but also your worth. I think there are a few risks to this that have become particularly clear during the pandemic and in the past few years. One is that your job might not always be there. If you are equating your job and your identity, if your job is your primary source of social activity and your primary way of deriving self-worth, and your job changes in some material way, or God forbid you lose your job, maybe to a global pandemic that's outside of your control, it can really send you for a loop. So, there's one risk there. The second, I think, is about expectations. And maybe this is where it coincides with the myth around the pursuit of dream jobs, which is, if we are always expecting our jobs to be perfect, if we are expecting our jobs to be our means of self-actualization, it can create a sky-high expectation that our jobs are not always designed to deliver. First, every job has some level of tedious or menial work that is part of what we do. And if you think about sort of happiness as like the difference between our expectations and our reality, with these through the roof expectations, it can create a lot of room for disappointment. And then, I think the third risk of believing that we are solely defined by our job is really the crux of the back half of the book, which is sort of an editorial argument about the value of diversifying our identities, which is to say that if you are giving all of your best time and all of your best energy to just one facet of who you are, to just your professional life, it can neglect other aspects of who you are. The psychoanalyst Esther Perel has this great phrase that I quote in the book, which is that so many people bring the best of themselves to work and bring the leftovers home. And it doesn't take a huge stroke of the imagination to see the risk in that.
Yeah. Michael Lewis, in an interview with Malcolm Gladwell, he grew up in New Orleans, and his father was a doctor there. And he said that in New Orleans, and he thinks that this is a culture that's now gone in New Orleans, but that there, it wasn't what you did, it was your relationships who really defined who you were. And so his father, of course, was a physician. It's a prestigious, high social capital kind of position, but really what mattered was who his friends were. And so I'm wondering if you have seen in different cultures or different places an alternative to work as the defining characteristic of who we are.
Yeah, I definitely think there are geographic and cultural components that play into this. I think part of the reason why this topic interests me so much is that my family's Italian. They're all from southern Italy. And they just have a different value system. They all work, for the most part, and it's still an important chunk of the pie chart of their weeks. And yet they have other values like faith and like family and their relationships that supersede work's importance in their life. I think there are, similar to what you said in New Orleans, even within the United States, there are regional differences about the importance of work. And I think there are also class differences. I think I chose to focus primarily on quote unquote knowledge workers in the book because they are the cohort that are more likely to look to work for identity. They're less likely to have other sources of community, like any sort of collective aid or neighborhood or community groups, frankly, because they don't have to be as reliant on their neighbors than folks who might come from less privileged or less resourced backgrounds. And I think that just in the past few years, knowledge workers are starting to see how this sort of atomization, this sort of work-centric existence is not actually serving them very well. We see a pandemic of loneliness across the country. We see people who are feeling hung out to dry when their large employer lets go thousands of employees, and people questioning, I've given so much of myself to this company. And it turns out that it was a transactional relationship all along. And so, to your point earlier about it's hard to dislodge this belief, I think it's really hard to tell someone to care less about their job or to deprioritize work. That's not very actionable advice. But what I found is, maybe similar to what Michael Lewis observed in New Orleans, is that the alternative is rather than caring less about your job, ensuring that you have the space and the time and the energy to invest in other things, whether it is your friendships or your recreational softball team that you play on, or the community garden or your PTA, what have you, is making sure that your job isn't crowding out all of these other identities that exist within each of us.
I know where I caught workism, and that's one of the terms that you use in the book. I think Derek Thompson coined it at The Atlantic, which is work as religion, is workism, the way he frames it. I know where I caught it. I caught it from my family, right? But if your family has a different cultural background, where did you catch it?
I think it was pretty self-imposed. My parents are both psychologists, and I wouldn't really say that either of them live too work-centric of an existence. I think they all modeled for me lives outside of work. And I think I initially caught the bug sort of in high school, where I was trying to carve out an identity for myself. And I went to college and I studied poetry and economics. And so you could already see this sort of tension between the pursuit of art and the pursuit of commerce. And I was trying to figure out who I was. And I really wanted a job to be that enamel pin that could have been the signal to everyone else in the world of who I was. I wanted to have something to hang my hat on because some of my friends knew they wanted to be a doctor since they were 14, and other friends were always on tracks to be a lawyer and had no idea. And so in some ways, I became so swept up in this pursuit of a dream job or the pursuit of a vocational soulmate because I was trying to figure out who I was.
Did you find tragic stories, like tragic work stories, when you were doing the research for this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you can imagine them yourself. Lots of stories of people getting laid off or moving across the country for a job and the employer not loving them back. I think there are some in the book that are maybe, what you'd expect. The story of the Wall Street banker is perhaps the most cliche. Someone who rises up the ranks of Wall Street only to realize that the view from the perch at the top of the org chart was not all that it was cracked up to be. I think there are more and more stories that are coming out each day. It's actually very trendy to be sharing these stories of getting screwed over by your job or having your expectations be let down. But I think, what holds my attention on this topic is that it's nuanced. It's not just don't care about your job or follow your passion or don't follow your passion or do what you love or don't do what you love. What we do for work matters. And so the question here is, how do you balance the pursuit of meaningful work without letting your work subsume who you are? And I think that's a question that each of us has to ask ourselves. And even if you come to an answer in one moment, it might change in the future. It's something that I'm still wrestling with myself.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really interesting challenge, which is how can I care about work if I do want to care about work without setting myself up for betrayal by work? And I think we went through a decade of zero interest rates. And so we have a generation of people who rose up in an environment with a lot of inexpensive money. And as that changes, there's a way in which there's an awful lot of people who were in jobs that were their first loves and they've never broken up before. And the level of betrayal and the level of shaking of their world model is incredible, especially because all the language in the companies, a lot of the companies, was the opposite of what was really the structure of a business.
Yeah, I really like the love metaphor. There's a direct parallel to our romantic lives, which is that in the same way that it's unrealistic to expect a spouse to fulfill our every social and emotional and financial need, it's also unrealistic to expect a job to be not only a paycheck, but also your primary community, also your sense of self-worth, also your purpose, your meaning, your reason for being. It's a burden that our jobs are not necessarily designed to bear.
You know where else that metaphor works really well is, I said this in an interview, I can't remember where it was, that so work is a lot like a relationship in a lot of different ways. And when I've interviewed for jobs in the past, I've thought to myself, this is not a job I can bring home to my parents. You know, if I interviewed with a job with a hedge fund, I'm like, you can't bring this one home to the parents because that is against their value system, or a defense contractor, for instance. But then there's this other sense that if the job you bring home is suitable for your family and is the job marriage that they value, when the divorce happens, it's a deep betrayal. It's not just a personal betrayal, it's destabilizing how you see yourself even in your own family. I ask a lot of people this question, which I will ask you at the end of the show, which is, what job do you hire your job to do for you? And one of the answers is, I hire my job to pay my debts. And the first time somebody said that to me, I thought they meant their school debts, but they didn't. They meant the debt to my family. They put me through college. My grandmother worked weekends to help me get through college. And me having this job is me showing them that that investment was worth it and that that sacrifice was worth it. It all ties very closely to these concepts of relationship.
But, I think the one big difference between a either romantic or familial relationship in the workplace is that I talk about this a bit in the chapter about family, is that they have fundamentally different goals. Our relationship to our work is fundamentally transactional. Companies hire employees that add value and fire employees that don't. The goal of the company is to think about, yes, its employees, but also its bottom line, and labor can be a huge cost. And there's a big difference between a, say, familial relationship where the expectation is that the love is unconditional, and an at-will employment contract, which is by definition conditional. And so, in the book, I advocate for a more transactional approach to work, which might sound a little crass, especially because we've been told that jobs are meant to be callings and vocations and identities. And thinking about a job as a transaction is less sexy, but it's thinking about, what is that exchange? What is the company giving to me, and what am I giving to the company, and how can we mutually enter into this contract in a way that feels mutually beneficial? Because I don't think it has to be exploitative. I think there might always be a tension between management and the rank and file, but it can definitely be healthier in some situations than others. I don't think we're doomed to just toil at necessary evils for the rest of our lives. And so I think that's sort of where our work intersects, is from your perspective as a manager, is thinking about the leaders of this world, and my perspective a little bit more on the side of workers is how can we enter into a contract, a social contract where neither party feels like they're being let down.
Yeah. There's, who was it? Thomas Davenport. So I position employees as customers. I think it was Thomas Davenport who wrote a book that framed employees as investors. And what's interesting about that framing is that there's this sense that as an investor, you might want to diversify your portfolio. And so that's a little bit of what you're saying, which is have an identity that's not entirely invested into this one thing, but diversify it. And so, how might a company design work as a platform that does not abuse or further or amplify, exploit the myths that cause us to overcommit? Or is their incentive just so much to get that overcommitment that it's hard for them to put it down?
It's a rich question. I think that it is actually in a company's best interest to be able to help employees diversify their identities or think about protecting their time off or their life outside of the office. Certainly in the short term, you can try and burn the candle at both ends. And if you have a short-term mentality, you might be able to get a lot done, and you will inevitably lose a lot of employees once they burn out or find a better alternative. If companies are thinking about how to design a culture that is sustainably productive in the long run, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive, thinking about, say, the bottom line and thinking about the employees' lives in and outside of the office. And so I think one big one is it really just boils down to trust. Trusting employees to be able to do work that is at a high level, that adheres to a high standard, but doesn't have to be micromanaged every step of the way. I think so often we are still living in a world that has all of these holdover proxies from a more industrial age where perhaps there was a more direct relationship between the number of hours people put in and the quality of work that comes out, or there was the necessity to have people clock in or chart their activities on a 6 or 15-minute increment to be able to ensure that they were not just mooches taking advantage of their employment status, and they were in fact getting good work done. And I think one of the silver linings that have come out of the pandemic is that with remote work and with some of these provocations for companies to redesign the way that they work, they've been forced to stop using some of these false metrics like the number of hours you spend in your office chair and actually look at the quality of work itself. So that's sort of like me on my high horse speaking from a philosophical standpoint. When it comes to practicality, I think one of the big ones is for leaders to model the type of culture that they hope to create. I think a lot of companies give a lot of lip service and have policies around work-life balance and might even bring a keynote speaker to talk about the importance of, self-care or what have you. But unless the people at the top are modeling the culture that they hope to create and creating norms about when people are expected to be on and off the clock, or making sure that they're not sending emails at 11:30 p.m. and trying to actually invest in other facets of who they are as well, then it's going to trickle down to the rest of the company. You can say all you want about the importance of having boundaries, but if the little icon next to the boss's name is illuminated at 10 p.m., what's going to stop their team from holding the same expectations for themselves as well? And I think a lot of companies are modeling a different way of working, and we're seeing that it doesn't necessarily have to come at the expense of productivity or a company's ability to be profitable.
You spoke wrote a little bit about fear. And one of the lines I really liked was, and let's see if I can reproduce it, the fear that if you don't exceed expectations, that your livelihood is at risk. And so It's a situation where even if the boss is showing you how to do it, you may still fear the precipice of unemployment and or whatever. It could be loss of status or some other thing. And so you made a recommendation, which was to disentangle survival and employment. Can you describe that?
Yeah. I think the broader point here is that so often when we think about interventions around developing a healthier relationship to work, the onus falls on the individual. We say things like, take care of yourself this weekend or set a boundary. But I actually think the people who are best positioned to be able to enact these changes are leaders at the institutional level. So that means leaders at a company or at the firm or even policymakers. I think part of the reason why our relationship to work is so fraught here in the United States is that the cost of losing employment is so high. The consequences are dire when, for example, we tie healthcare to our employment status, or if you're an immigrant, your ability to stay in this country is tied to your employment status. And so the argument I'm making there about disentangling survival and our basic human needs from employment is if we had a more robust social safety net, if the consequences of losing work didn't mean you're losing your ability to stay alive or pay for your health care, we would have a lot more security and safety to allow people to, first of all, leave jobs that aren't good enough, to not have to white knuckle grip these jobs just because they're their sole means of paying healthcare. It will incentivize employers to have to design better places to work as opposed to relying on the vice grip they have over their employees' livelihood as being the only means of getting them to stay. And it'll allow people to take more risks, to start more companies, to experiment with their own careers, to be able to try and actually find jobs that have a high match quality between their interests and their skills and what they can get paid to do. And so, I don't want to overly romanticize some of the Nordic countries, for example, that we often get thrown around in these conversations that have a really robust social services programs. But I think the point is clear that one reason why our relationship to work is so broken is that the stakes are just too high.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which it's a threat of violence. I mean, there's two kinds of violence that you just mentioned right there. And I say violence, but what I really mean is physical harm, which is if you lose your health benefits, you are at physical risk. And being thrown out of the country, which can happen very fast when you lose employment, is banishment from a country where your kids may be citizens and have never been to your home country. I mean, it's like, those are serious things. And retirement is another existential threat, the ability to protect yourself in older age.
Not to mention the risks that can be incurred on the job itself. This huge loneliness report just came out from the Surgeon General of the US. And one of the primary leading indicators was a culture of work centricity that is atomizing people from the people around them. And through overwork, more people die each year than from malaria. It's conflating a little bit some of the different types of overwork that exist. I think the one I really center in the book is this sort of subjective choice to treat work as your primary means of worth and choosing to give so much time to the office. And a lot of people don't have that choice. The majority of workers don't work to self-actualize, they work to survive. But in addition to those harms and those violences that you mentioned, I think there's a lot of very real violence and harm that's occurring on the clock right now.
Can you describe the Stockton UBI experiment?
Yeah, so universal basic income has become a bit of a cliche in work-focused books these days. But the Stockton experiment was a really interesting one because it happened in my backyard. And second is this longitudinal study that has been pretty robust in the way that they've reported data in both quantitative and qualitative ways. And the thing that really stood out for me from talking to people that were involved in the study was that there's this sort of misconception that if we give people more social support, either in the form of direct cash like UBI or with things like increased unemployment benefits or healthcare provisions, child tax credit, what have you, that it'll deplete their motivation bucket, that they will no longer be incentivized to work hard and will all suffer. And the key stat from the Stockton study that really stood out to me was that people who were given this UBI benefit, this cash allowance each month, were more likely to have found stable paid employment than a control group that wasn't given these cash infusions. And I think it's this talking point, especially from politicians, that if we give people handouts, they'll just sit on their couch all day. And I don't think that's true. I mean, it's definitely not borne out in my own experience. I think there is an innate human drive to want to contribute, to want to find a way to work in concert with people around them, to find an issue that you care about, that you want to try to improve. And I think what the UBI trial really shows us is that by giving individuals more support, they can find jobs that are better. And it'll incentivize employers to have to create better jobs. And it can be a positive ripple effect. We've seen this a lot during the pandemic, where we had this period where some of these progressive pipe dreams of social support became realities. There were increased unemployment benefits. There were things like the child tax credit that allowed parents to have a little bit more support. And instead of driving people to not work, I think one of the big misconceptions of the Great Resignation is that it was a bunch of people quitting jobs just to bum around. But in actuality, the majority of people who quit jobs during the past 2 years quit to find better jobs. They didn't just leave the job and stay out of the job market. They left the job to find jobs that paid better, that had jobs that had better conditions or better workplace protections. That is the upshot of a more robust social safety net, is that we'll have to create more better jobs for more people.
I want to switch over to talking about your work. And part of the reason I want to do that is then I want to go back through some of your ideas and talk about how they might have affected your work. So I'm going to ask a question that I often ask at the end of the show, which is, what job do you, Simone, hire your job to do for you?
It's a great question. I took a fair amount of business classes in college and often think about that. Was it Clayton Christensen model about jobs to be done, and thinking about what jobs our jobs do is a really interesting question. I mean, I think first and foremost, I hire my job to pay for my life. I think brass tacks, that's the fundamental reason why I work. There are certainly other reasons as well. And my work, I think, allows me to be able to scale the connection that I have with people around me. Writing can be a very solitary act, but I think one of the biggest things I've learned recently is how putting writing out into the world can actually be a huge means of connection. And every day I get emails from people that connected with the work. And I think that is a huge way. I think part of it is to fuel my own creative expression, my way of figuring out what I have to say and trying to be a creative person in the world. I derive flow state often from writing and through my work. I believe that I get to fire on all cylinders on days when I feel like I'm really in the zone writing. But I think it's important to underline that in addition to all of those other jobs I hire my job to do, the main one is to be able to live in a place that I love to live, to be able to think about my family and providing security and stability for them, and to be able to pay for the food and the activities and the housing that make my material existence possible.
There are a lot of ways that you could have provided for your material existence. Becoming an author is not the obvious one. And so it feeds these other pieces, right? Which is scaling your connection and creative expression and getting you into the wonderful flow state of writing when it works. Has the job you have arrived at through this, does it meet your expectations? And so one of the things about being a writer, I mean, not a writer for a magazine or something else where somebody else is doing most of the advertising for you, but being an author of books is that you have to come on podcasts all the time. And all of a sudden, you maybe want to be a writer about anything, but you've become an expert on work. And now people want to talk to you about work. And so is it adding up to what you expected?
Yeah. I left my job at IDEO about a year ago now, and I was actually reflecting on this exact question about sort of what would my expectations of self-employment and being an author be like versus the reality. And the truth is, I had assumed that a lot of the drive to overwork was passed down from the corporate world, whether it be a manager or a boss or the incentives of our capitalist market. And I started working for myself, and I learned that I was the worst manager that I'd ever had. I would lash myself on weeks where I didn't hit my writing goal and inevitably open up the laptop again on weekends. And I was forced to sort of practice more of what I preach in the book and try and internalize some of this wisdom about the value in not solely deriving my self-worth based on my output, and the value of making sure that I'm carving out space and time to invest in other things that I find meaningful beyond my ability to produce economic value, and the value of setting boundaries about when I'm starting and stopping the workday so it doesn't just seep like a gas until all of my unoccupied space. And so I think this is all to say that part of my position as a journalist and as a writer is not to be the guru. I don't think I have all of this stuff figured out. And I don't think anyone does, to be honest. I think it's frankly a wobble and something that we continually have to ask ourselves of, okay, what role do I want work to have in my life? Am I over-indexing on one aspect of who I am more than others? Is this a season where I'm prioritizing work or prioritizing life outside of work? These things are all in flux. But one of the great benefits of having a little bit more autonomy over how I spend my time and what I choose to work on is I felt that I'm in a much less reactive state rather than responding to the myriad Slack notifications or emails flooding into my inbox. By working for myself, I've been able to do more proactive choosing of how I spend my days.
That's a really good outcome, to have the room to craft your own experience of work. So first of all, because I've been framing work as a product that people buy, one of the things that I've realized in my research is that it's very, very hard to find a product with all of the features that you want. And it's part of the reason that you might have two cars. You have one that parks well in the city and one that you can take off-roading to go fishing someplace or go camping. And these are two cars because you have to have two different products. And that's just because some features of products are antagonistic with each other. You can't have those two features in the same product because high clearance, four-wheel drive just doesn't go with fuel economy and parking in the city very well. The truth is that there is no job as a product that's probably going to tick every box on your list. You'd need two lives to fit it all in. So have you decided what is good enough for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. Does the author eat his own dog food?
Well, it's not exactly to see if you're eating your own dog food. It's really much more to say, here's somebody who's been thinking about it longer than I have, and you might be asking yourself that question.
Yeah, totally. I think my favorite thing about the term good enough or the framework is that it's subjective. You get to choose what good enough means to you. And maybe to one person, it's a job that pays a certain amount of money. And to someone else, it's a job that has a certain title or is in a certain industry. And maybe to someone else, it's a job that gets off at a certain hour so they can pick up their kids from elementary school. And I think for me these days, what I'm optimizing for is a job where I get to write most days, where I don't feel like my calendar is full of meetings, where I don't feel like I have to respond to the needs of dozens of other people, and I can really follow the energy of my day and be able to be a little bit more responsive, not to the demands of my boss or a team or the company, but to the demands of my body, and trying to calibrate the intuitive sense of when I feel I have the capacity to do different types of work. And so I think, my hierarchy of good enough these days is a job that lets me live in San Francisco, a job that makes me able to refine this craft of writing, and then fundamentally a job that allows me to be the person who I want to be, that allows me to go and play in a pickup basketball game at 5 o'clock on a weekday without second guessing myself, or allows me to wake up one morning when it's sunny and say, I am not in the right mind state to be reading this academic study or to try and finish this conclusion. I'm going to go for a walk. That's what good enough means to me today.
Have you gotten any responses to the book that surprised you?
Yeah, I think there are two demographics of people that the message seems to really be resonating with that I didn't expect. The first is recent retirees. I, sort of thought I was writing a book for myself and my peers. I'm kind of smack in the middle of the millennial generation. I think we were raised with certain scripts about what work could or couldn't deliver. And I was writing a book to sort of rebalance the scales. And I think recent retirees go through a similar existential questioning that maybe I did when I was trying to decide between those two jobs, where if for 30, 40, 50 years, a job had been a pillar or the sole pillar of your identity, and then you retire, you have to build yourself back up again. And I have corresponded with a number of septuagenarians, for example, that are wrestling with the same questions that a recent college grad might be wrestling with.
That makes total sense to me. I just reduced my work to 20% so that I could have 80% to write and do this sort of thing. And I thought it would come with some leisure. Nope. No leisure whatsoever. Immediately filled up every free hour. And it was really lovely. I spent 3 days reading your book really deeply, really thinking about it. That's a kind of leisure. I mean, it's certainly a luxury, to really be able to go deeply into a book and take time and think about it and then come out of it. But it is a question of why? Why am I still working so hard? I thought that's what I was going to stop doing. And so, yeah, you're right. Absolutely right. I'm not a full retiree, but I could have been. And I decided to go to 20%. And it's definitely one of those moments of asking those questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when you ask why, I want to give you a hug, because I don't think it's just on you. I don't think it's just Dart's sort of like internalized capitalist that's pushing you to work all the time. I think part of it is cultural. Our country was founded under the belief that hard work would lead to heaven, and the Protestant work ethic and capitalism are sort of the two strands that entwine to form our country's DNA. I think part of it is circumstantial. If you're surrounded by a lot of ambitious, overachieving types, it's hard not to think, I've got to keep up with the Joneses, and why aren't I, driving a Mercedes? And I think part of it is the nature of seasons. And maybe this is a season where you'll really dive into work or work adjacent activities to scratch some of those intellectual pursuits that you have. And maybe it'll be followed by a season of prioritizing, stand-up paddleboarding or whatever else might bring joy to your life. And I think one of the things that you're doing that's inspirational to me is spending some time in different cultures. And I'm sure in Medellin, you're a different person than you are in Santa Cruz, and you're a different person than you are in Sweden, what have you. I think that one of the greatest things that people can do to help renegotiate their relationship to work or to gain some perspectives is to remove themselves from the grooves of their daily existence. Not just to have to observe how other cultures with different value systems live, but just to be able to reacquaint yourself with who you are when you're in a less rat race focused lifestyle.
Yeah, it's interesting how much it can be treated as or framed as an addiction, because it's the sort of thing where you need to get away from your drinking buddies and just get out of town for a little bit. Can be very helpful. I can totally see that. What does your job cost you?
There's this meme that I quote in the book, which is this artist who takes this, the canonical phrase, do what you love and never work a day in your life. And he crosses out the second half of the phrase and he says, do what you love and work all the time and take everything extremely personally and have no boundaries between when you are and aren't working. I'm paraphrasing. But I think that's the biggest thing that it costs me. I feel very lucky to have found work that I genuinely enjoy and I look forward to doing. And the cost is that it's hard to turn off my brain. It's hard to know when I'm having a conversation and mining for a story or having a conversation to really be present in the moment. Just last night I was lying in bed trying to go to sleep and I couldn't stop thinking about this lead of this piece that I was writing. I think that's one big cost. I think the second cost is just an inflated sense of importance. There's this anecdote that I quote from in the beginning of the book of this conversation that I had with a mentor of mine, this professional poet named Anis Mojgani. And I had the opportunity to interview him. He's the poet laureate of the state of Oregon now. And when I was in college, I interviewed him and I said, Anis, how do you feel about the phrase, do what you love and never work a day in your life? And he said something that I'll never forget. He said, Simone, some people do what they love for work and others do what they have to for work so they can do what they love when they're not working. And neither is more noble. And I think that last part is key, the sort of nobility aspect of it, because I think one of the things that my job costs me is the ability to be able to say, actually, maybe you don't have to be a New York Times bestselling author, or you don't have to write 10 books, and maybe you can just think about your job as more of a means to an end than an end in of itself. And I think that sort of guilt I feel from my own ambition and the cost of trying to satiate whatever hole inside my soul I'm trying to fill with work is something that is ever present, even when things are going well in my professional life.
There's a funny loop in what you just said. And it's the experience of the flow state of writing is something that you really enjoy in the moment. And in order to have a lifestyle in which you get to choose the kind of topics that are going to put you in the position to experience that kind of flow, you have to be successful enough as a writer to meet the other demands of your work, one of which is to take care of your family, and to fund your life. And so in that loop, there's going to be things that you probably have to do that are not ideal. And one of them is promoting your book all over. I mean, I don't know. I'm assuming that I don't know why I pick on that. It's partially because it's because
that's what we're doing right now.
That's what we're doing right now, right? But it's also just that I have found recently that being on a quest to transform the way management works, I've been on the road like a stand-up comedian going from conference to conference to speak on this. And do I love that? I guess the jury is out on that, whether or not I love that. But there's a thing that if you're trying to make a particular change, part of your job is to be a stand-up and to work really hard on the road getting a message out. And so I assume it's very much the same. Do you do book readings in person?
ever?
Yeah, I just got back from a tour, and I mean, the great irony is I've written this book about right-sizing work's place in our life, and I've never worked harder on anything in my life.
And what that entails is that sometimes, you stay in a nice hotel and you go to a reading and there's a great audience. And sometimes you stay in a crappy hotel and you go to a reading and it's hardly anybody's there. That may not be what you signed up for. And so somewhere in the loop of creating really what is a good enough job, there's going to be steps in that loop that may not be great.
Yeah. And I think that's where treating a job as good enough can be liberating, because when it really cuts is when you are expecting your job to be perfect. And then you show up to the reading and there's 3 people in the audience, and it doesn't just feel like a professional failure. It feels like your whole self-worth can come shattering down with it. And I think that's something that I'm trying to keep in mind. And I think that's like a good takeaway for the listeners, is urging them to be able to make sure that they are finding other ways to derive worth and meaning and community outside of the office. One of the great things about, say, playing pickup basketball is people could care less about what I do for work when I go play in like the weekly game. They don't care about how many words I've written or how many books I've sold. They care if I like box out when I rebound and I'm a good passer, and I think, like what you said about the drinking buddies, one of the problems is if you're just centering your world around work and surrounding yourself with your professional, working buddies, it's hard to escape the loop. And all it takes is a healthy interaction with someone that doesn't care about your performance review or how many widgets you sold in the past few weeks, to help keep that perspective.
That's funny. The part about pickup basketball, I studied literature in graduate school, and we were always sitting around a table, kind of knives out, intellectually, challenging each other. And then we went out to play a game of pickup basketball one time, and I said, "Oh, wait a second, I'm 6'4". It was like, changed the whole relationship. Like all of a sudden, in that context, the power dynamic was completely different. But I like your point, which is it's just being around people who don't care about your book ranking in Amazon or something. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have?
I really enjoyed this conversation. I think it has forced me to reflect a lot. And, I think there's a lot in the book about the history of work and how we got to this place and sort of work trends over time. But I think the richness for me is trying to grapple with, okay, on the other side of reporting this book for 3 years, what has or hasn't changed for me? And, I think we got into maybe the deepest issue, which is that there are no easy answers here. This is the work of a lifetime of figuring out what role work should have in our lives. And there's no sort of static work-life balance proverbial state where you like find Atlantis and then start floating 5 feet above the ground in lotus pose. It's a question that is going to be something that I continue to wrestle with. And I appreciate you creating the space and asking the questions that forced me to do so.
I recently when I was traveling with my wife. We're in Colombia right now, and we were up in an area called Jardín. And we got to the town a little bit early. And so we had to sit outside the hotel waiting for them to unlock their doors. And it just so happened we were sitting at this table, overlooking a valley, beautiful birds everywhere. And there was a guy singing ranchero music right there. It was a grandfather singing it to his grandkids, and it was just beautiful. And I didn't have a worry in the world. I didn't have a thought in my head. I wasn't being intellectual at all. And I thought, don't like this. I don't actually like this. It was like, if this lasted for any amount of time, I'd be dead any minute. And I don't know how to have my head empty. So it's another point about, on the one hand, it was so pleasant and it was so idyllic. On the other hand, I wouldn't want it to last. So I agree with your point about getting out of your normal situation so that you can have those moments.
It sounds like that inability to clear your mind is one of the things that your job costs you.
Right.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
The best place is thegoodenoughjob.com. That's the book's website. It has all my social media handles. I run a book club, or it's an article book club, where I send out an article to a group of people twice a month to read together. You can find all of that information there.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's fantastic.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.